Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar Block Grants, a Heavy Lift. My name is Suki Norris and I work with the ECHO Group and have been with the ECHO Group for almost 25 years. If you download the slide deck, which you're able to do, you'll be able to get a sense of what my background is. But suffice to say, I've been at the ECHO Group for about 25 years and I was a lawyer about 10 years before that, so I have a broad base of experience to sort of cover the kinds of topics we're going to cover today. This webinar is sponsored by my employer, the ECHO Group. Now, just some information. You can always submit a question on the bottom left of your screen at any point during the presentation. All questions are going to be answered during the last 10 minutes of the program. For resources, you can find the PDF of the presentation and additional resources under the headshot image located on the left of your screen. And for any assistance, you see the email address of Melissa Pangaro, and you can always reach out directly to her for help. You can get credit for this. This is the information for getting your NADAC credit for this webinar. To receive credit, you have to watch the program all the way through the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Please don't leave the console. If you stay on the platform, you'll automatically be redirected to an evaluation landing page. If this is your first time attending a webinar in 2019, you're going to need to create a NACCME account when you are first directed to the landing page. For all subsequent webinars you attend, you'll already have an account and will just need to log in. After completion of the evaluation, you'll be able to download or print your certificate. NAADAC credit is only offered for the live broadcast. So to get into the topic of today's webinar, what I want to do today is cover block grants from a couple of different perspectives. So this is a basic introduction. We're going to look at how Medicaid is funded, and while I would assume that most everybody knows how Medicaid is funded, this is just a sort of level set so we understand what block grants are really going to address if they come into being. We'll look at block grants and define them. We're going to look at the history of non-Medicaid block grants. Non-Medicaid block grants have been around for a very long time, probably since about 1940, more prevalent in the last 40 years. And then a history of Medicaid block grants. If you've read the newspapers lately, this isn't the first time we've been dealing with the possibility of block grants, and we'll look at that. And then we'll look at what's going on currently. What are the plans? What kind of proposals? And then we're going to look and see if block grants could work, possibly. I then want to look at both the concerns and give you some ideas of actions you can take if you are concerned about the possibility of block grants coming into your agency or into your state. So how is Medicaid funded? One of the most important tenets of Medicaid is that it is a joint federal and state funding source. The federal portion is the federal medical assistance percentage, and it runs from 50 to 74%, depending on the income level or the level of poverty in a given state. There are 70 million people on Medicaid, which represents almost 21 to 22% of the population in the country. $1 out of every $6 spent on health care goes to Medicaid. And the current system gives states a fair amount of flexibility. They can determine what services are covered, how providers are paid, and how those services are delivered. One of the most important things about it being, and I'll say this a couple of times during the webinar, about this being a joint state and federal funded program, is that when a state or the country hits a particular rough spot, a disease, a recession, when more people need more services or more expensive services, the burden of that is shared by state and federal. And that works to ensure that people are covered. So how do we define block grants? It becomes a preset amount for Medicaid, a lump sum. You, state, are going to get this many dollars to cover Medicaid, and then I, the federal government, am out. I no longer have any responsibility until we determine next year what your dollar amount will be. There is no increase due to unexpected costs of any sort. If we have a hurricane season like we've had in the past, and states are faced with many people who are out of jobs, who are facing healthcare crises, there will be no more dollars from the Medicaid fund. It has to have some kind of annual increase, but oftentimes, as we'll see, the index that's used for determining what the rate of increase for block grants, that's used for block grants, is not the healthcare inflation index. It's more the consumer price index, which grows slower than the healthcare index does. The final thing about block grants is we do risk service disrupted to people who rely on Medicaid, not just because there's no coverage for unexpected costs, but also because the purpose of block grants is oftentimes to decrease the total cost of Medicaid. If I decrease the cost of Medicaid and tell a state, you can do what you want, this is now your money, you make the decisions, one of the possibilities is to decrease the number of services that are provided, decrease the rates given to providers, or decrease the numbers of Medicaid people who are enrolled. So the next slide gives us a little bit of a comparison between what happens with the current process, what happens with block grants, and then a per capita grant, which is similar to a block grant. The only difference being that rather than it being a lump sum determined by a calculation, a per capita cap gives you a dollar amount per person on Medicaid at the beginning of the fiscal year. But you'll see as you look at this that in the current Medicaid program, as we've talked about, there's guaranteed coverage. There shouldn't be a waiting list or any caps. The federal funding is guaranteed and it will, as I said, respond to program needs. There are state matching payments. And then important is it is a set in law, and states have a flexibility to expand. There are words you may have heard of, 1115 waivers, other waivers, your state plan. In each of these instances, the state has the ability to expand the services with the sign-off of the federal government that the direction the state is going is an okay direction. In a block grant, we know some things. We know there's absolutely no guarantee against wait lists or caps on services or number of people enrolled. We know that it's not based on enrollment costs or program needs. It's fixed with a concept of a preset growth. We know there aren't going to be matching payments, and we know that there's no federal spending tied to the state beyond that initial grant or cap. As far as federal standards, we were, when this was written, and we still are, quite uncertain what requirements would be to obtain federal funds, how people will go about determining the amount of the cap, how people will even apply to receive their Medicaid funding through CAP. And we'll talk about that. And then per capita cap is a little bit different in that it is capped per enrollee, but it's not based on healthcare costs. It's just based on a fixed amount for enrollee, which tells you that a seriously mentally ill person will get the same amount as a person who is not diagnosed with any mental illness on Medicaid. So there's no contemplation for the severity of the diagnosis or the needs of the individual. We know that so you get the idea that block grants can be very limiting. Another truth about block grants is really an addressing the baseline spending. The first year a block grant is given, that's the base year. And then a growth factor is given. Historically, the raise of cost, the increase based on the block grant is significantly less, as you can see by this graph, than the actual increase in the cost of Medicaid enrollees and Medicaid programs. And that's one of the things that it's a serious concern of people who are looking at block grants. Now, it's only fair to say, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, that block grants do give states a significant amount of control over their own programs and policies. They don't need to go to the federal government to get approval for innovation, for changing the services, for making any of the decisions that they want to make at the state level to better address the needs of their population. In cases such as Rhode Island, where states have been given plenty of money to cover the cost of Medicaid and the increases, in fact, it has improved some of the services that they've done. It has improved some of the core tenets of what they want, what Rhode Island, as an example, wanted Medicaid to look like. So when the money is significant, when the block grants meet the entire needs, block grants do give states some fairly important control over how they spend their money with little or no federal oversight. So where did block grants come from? Block grants have been around for a very long time. It was a way of giving aid. It really served two purposes. There were programs that the government was responsible, like the improvement of a road, that was a single moment in time program that required this bridge to be fixed or this interstate to be repaved. And the government used block grants as sort of single instance contracts to get that work done. And that made good sense and still does. In 1981, block grants were about 17% of the federal budget. And while grants can be used to support one-time projects, the grant concept moved into other areas, into child health care, into a replacement for welfare, for aid to family, AFDC, or aid to families with dependent children. So it was used really in these two disparate cases. Do I have this single need, which is going to be dealt with by a single program, or am I looking to take a entitlement and move it to something that I can fix the cost of more directly using a block grant? Some basic block grants here kind of show the difference. Child welfare, food stamps, Head Start, those were all things that really were programs that were entitlements that were moved to block grants to sort of, I think, in some instances reduce the cost, control the cost, or give control to the states. And then there were other things that were one-time, job access and reverse commute, job training, other things that the federal government could put a grant in place to train people to really to create programs that states could take over, states could be responsible for. And we see that today. Those same kind of programs all do kind of come into play. They happen. They're available. The challenge with each of these that we have seen over and over again is that when the grant is for a program that lasts year after year, so it really takes the place of an entitlement or another method by which the federal government was funding the program, the decrease in payments is real, and it's something that affects the states. Either the total dollar amount is actually decreased, or it doesn't meet the rise in inflation or the consumer price index or those indexes that will show the states what it is really costing the states for these programs to be in effect. Again, it isn't saying that all block grants are designed to ensure that there's not enough money to do something. So many block grants really do get the kinds of jobs done that need to get done. Roads, school buildings, those kinds of programs that take that require a set of tasks that is controlled and done within a fixed amount of time. Medicaid block grants followed. There really have been two different times where you might have heard of block grants. In 2002, block grants were suggested or put into the budget, but they were done in a way that was a little different. They looked at it as two different allotments. And in this way, they dealt with the difference in the severity of the diagnoses within the Medicaid population. They had one allotment for folks who were acute and another allotment for people who were in long-term care. The idea was to better associate the dollar amount that's going to the states with what the states would actually need based on the care they were providing. In 2017, there were really two different options. Both were to remove the federal match, the FMAP, or the federal matching program, away to a block grant or a per capita allotment. In a block grant, as we talked before, a fixed amount was going to go to the state with some sort of analysis done based on what the current cost of Medicaid was in that state. The other choice was the per capita allotment, which was going to be a fixed amount for each enrollee. And the index for the increase was on inflation, not medical cost growth. Now, if you remember back to the beginning when we talked about the federal matching, I said it was something like between 50 and 70%. One of the real issues that come up when people talk about block grants is how the federal match is going to come into effect. So are they going to look at the level of support needed by a state to determine the total block grant amount? Or are they going to take that away and essentially even out the country as if the cost of services everywhere was exactly the same, and every state would get a basis of the same block grant based on relative size or relative Medicaid population if it was a per capita allotment? One of the concerns people have is that could cause problems in either event, whether it was too much weighted to the states getting a high level of match, or it was just evened out without regard to the match. In either instance, there is some concern that there would be states whose block grant amount or per capita amount would not even start to meet the needs of their Medicaid population on day one. All of what I've talked about so far has been history. With that said, and the reason this webinar is really going forward is because if you, like me, have seen article after article about block grants and Medicaid in the President's most recent budget, it's that I really began to think about as I looked at what block grants were and began doing this research. So what are those current plans? One of the big differences between the current plans and what you might have heard that the states are doing, or I talked about what was history, is that every plan now is that the states can opt into block grant funding. So they don't have to do it. Right now it is seen as an opt-in funding mechanism. The biggest challenge that states are facing, should they be thinking about block grants, is while the block grant was put into the budget, there was no path to block grant that's been provided. It is unclear whether it's a request, it's just a state action. There needs to be an 1115 waiver that's an innovation waiver, or how states are supposed to go about moving towards a block grant or a per capita grant, but in this instance, block grants. Given that statement, you'll see that there are 4 states moving forward, but similar to the work requirements in Medicaid that had very little substantive programming and process around them, these don't either, and the likelihood is that the cost is going to be the cost of the litigation to determine what's a fair grant, what isn't, are block grants legal, and are the potential injuries of block grants, specifically less coverage, no increase in coverage in the case of national emergency or some other kind of unexpected event. Is that fair? Are you allowed to, can states manage their Medicaid population in such a way? I'll say this again, I believe, but up until today in Medicaid, the waivers have always been, how do I increase or change or expand how I'm going to offer services, or to whom I'm going to offer services, or how I'm going to offer services. No waiver is allowed to go forward that says, I am going to limit the services. I'm going to decrease the number of people I cover. I am going to increase the difficulty it is to find services or to be enrolled. And it is conceivable that block grants, if the funding mechanism is not sufficient to match the current cost of Medicaid, are going to do just that. And to have a mechanism that will allow that to happen is important because, as I'll state in a little bit, what a mechanism does is ensure stakeholder involvement in decision making. Of the 4 states that you see on the slide that are currently reviewing the possibility of block grants, not one that I can find has had active stakeholder involvement. There have been news stories, to be sure. There have been interest groups who have expressed concern or support. But that stakeholder involvement that comes when a press release is put out, think of it this way, when a new waiver is done at the state level, it is required that the state explain what stakeholder involvement there's been in determining the content of the waiver. Right now, when these states go after their block grants, they have no requirement that they have that stakeholder involvement. And yet they are moving towards it. Tennessee has signed a bill, and the governor has signed that. Utah, the governor was mandated in the budget to submit a per capita cap waiver, but hasn't done so yet, and there seems to be a lot of discussion as to how that's going to go forward. Alaska expressed interest, and I think an interesting statement about Alaska is the governor of Alaska was actually reached out to move towards a block grant. It was thought it would be a good idea, and people in Washington, D.C. reached out to the governor it was when the state of Alaska citizens found out that the governor sort of said, well, we have a foot in the door, but we're not necessarily going forward with that. And the same has occurred in Georgia. Beyond those 4 states, no state has publicly indicated that they are looking that they're looking to move to block grants. It doesn't mean that those states aren't thinking about it in some manner or another. So I think a fair question is, can block grants work? In a perfect situation where the dollar amounts are equal to the cost of care, where there is a elevator that would increase the cost if in fact there was a public emergency, a national disaster, a disease that that was unexpected, then what do block grants give the state? An ability to design a creative care delivery. It is true that in most states, and I say most states, and I'm certain there are people that are listening that are on states that live in states where this isn't true, but in most states, Medicaid hasn't changed very much over the years. After the first wave of waivers, and some people moved to managed care for the prior AFDC kids and the like. The reality is Medicaid has stayed pretty stagnant. There have been innovations. People have done different things with the programs, with methods of programs. They've looked at how they might provide substance abuse services and be a little bit more expansive in that. But they've done that. They haven't done as much as we might think they have, or they might think to do in the future. So the question we ask is, will block grants truly give the states that ability to be creative? And I would follow it with one more question. If the states are really that creative, what's kept them from being that creative up till now? CMS has never said, don't submit a waiver that's creative. And I know for a fact that there are states that do very, very, very innovative planning and programming within their waiver. So why would a block grant give a state a better sense of the ability to be creative? Another reason might be to deliver care cost effectively. I kind of asked the same question to this one. If states can be cost effective, the bigger problem is, why aren't they? It ought not to take a block grant or a per capita cap to get a state to operate effectively. We want, and you as providers want, to offer the most effective services you can in a cost-effective but a cost-realistic manner. And if you can do it, why would a block grant be the kicker for that to happen? Another reason is use resources to address the needs to those who need it most. Many of you who are listening work in community behavioral health and community, perhaps FQHCs. I would guess that if I were to send out a question, you would all agree that you are the resources who are most needed. How is a block grant going to make that different? If it's true, one of the fears of block grants is that it will cause rural hospitals to go out of business because the reimbursement rates just won't cover the cost. If that's the effect, how are we really moving resources to address the needs to those who need it most? They will adjust to cost of living. Medicaid costs don't adjust to the cost of living. They adjust to the cost of health care. It's important that we see that the Medicaid provides the coverage necessary to provide care for all the enrollees in Medicaid. Having wait lists, having people who don't have access to resources close to where they are isn't a positive. It's a hurtful thing. It won't provide more care. It's going to make care more difficult and encourage private insurance. It is quite conceivable it will encourage private insurance. But what will encourage private insurance and encourage Medicaid the most is if the costs of health care come under control. So if block grants work and they do bring cost of care under control, then block grants are a good way to go. But if block grants can do it, my question to you folks is, why can't we do it anyway? It's just a thought. So the first thing is concerns. The CMS requires that waivers have to address, an 1115 waiver has to address one of or both of the following. It either has to dispense with operational requirements, meaning some kind of requirements that control who has access to care and how care is accessed have to be dispensed with in a waiver. Or it has to treat a currently uncovered cost as medical assistance. What that means is waivers look to manage costs in order to expand the continuum of care that's offered. That's important because if we can increase the care that's offered to people that may not, to an uncovered cost, perhaps we can work to decrease the cost of care overall. The challenge is, with block grants, neither of these elements are being waived. So the concept that you might use a waiver to get a block grant requires legislation to really change the waiver requirements. Because if I'm going in to get a block grant, I can't tell you that I'm dispensing with operational requirements, or I can't tell you for certain that I'm going to treat something uncovered as a cost to be covered. In fact, if my first block grant is less than or equal to what my cost of care was last year, the likelihood is the best I can do is to continue doing what I was doing. But it's not likely that I'll be able to increase the coverage. Another concern, and I've said this a couple of times, is that block grants are tied to the General Consumer Price Index, not the medical portion. The difference is dramatic. We can have a different webinar about why the costs of healthcare are as high as they are and why they continue to rise. That's not the point of this. The point of this is that block grants aren't designed to solve the cost of healthcare. They're designed to solve the cost of Medicaid. That's only $1 in $6 currently being spent on healthcare. So unless we deal with the cost of those that's the other $5 in essence, we are not going to meet the increasing. It is almost a guarantee that we won't meet the needs of the increase in costs of Medicaid. And if that weren't enough, we would look at 13 block grants that were decreased by an average of 27% between 2000 and 2017. Now, many of you are too young to remember this, but some of you know that between 2000 and 2017, a fairly significant recession hit this country. In that instance, we would expect block grants to at least stay steady because the number of people needing those services would increase. But that's not what happened. It decreased between over 27% during that time. It's also a little known, I think a little known fact, but maybe not, Puerto Rico receives Medicaid through a block grant. The numbers there, and if you think about what's been going on in Puerto Rico, and you think about a block grant, you know that one of the real effects of the hurricane were medical services and the needs that far outstrip the ability to provide care. And one of the problems, their block grant didn't change because there was the worst hurricane in history. It stayed the same, but the needs of the citizens certainly did. And that's a real, probably the starkest of reality of what block grants could do, what the challenge of block grants are. Another place where block grants could be significantly problematic is with child services, with the services we get for our kids. We know that kids who get basic medical services probably do better in school, are less likely to develop childhood or adult illnesses. But as we put grant funding to for covering kids, and we start diminishing the services, the risks are several-fold over what providing coverage at a reasonable level could be for those kids. So if you have any questions about block grants, I suggest you look at both the children's health programs and Puerto Rico and ask yourself, can block grants really provide the kind of innovation that some people say is available within block grants? And do I have a better method to find that innovative solution? So one of the areas where we will all agree a true public health crisis has emerged is in substance use disorder. If you look at this, while opioid deaths were rising dramatically, the block grant program that was to deal with those didn't. It stayed flat. Now, I will be one of the first to say that there are that there has been additional funding given to for dealing with substance abuse and opioid deaths. But even if that were added to the graph, the fact of the matter is the cost of care, or the number of deaths, has increased at a rate nowhere near the spending. And this is an instance where we know that if spending truly did expand the concept of services provided, expanded the availability of services, there would be more services today to deal with the number of deaths that we're facing and the number of people who need treatment. Many of you live in states that have a high rate of opioid deaths. Some live in states where where it's under control. I'm calling in from New Hampshire, where for our population, we are 1 or 2 in the country with the number of deaths. We are only now opening the programs necessary to address this need. We are only now, and in the last couple of years, getting the dollars we need to not solve, but at least address the challenges that this state faces. And while this state isn't like every other state, we do have some similar characteristics. There's a large rural population in New Hampshire that is, I joke that everything in New Hampshire is 2 hours away from something. It's a large rural population that may be an hour away from services. It's a large rural population that may be 2 hours away from a psychiatrist who can manage meds. It has reasonable but not over-the-top internet capacity if you want to do telepsychiatry or telemedicine. We are the state that is that statistic, as many of you folks are in the states you live. And it is a challenge that I can't completely comprehend, that we are focused more on block grants than we are on creatively solving and providing the adequate service level for the people that need it most. Now, this is a graph of people who have died from overdose. I could also provide you a graph of people with serious mental illness, how the number of suicides has increased, how the need for services has increased, but dollar amounts have stayed rather stagnant. That's the best scenario. If people are correct and history is a precursor for the future, we're not looking at dollar amounts staying stagnant. We are looking at dollar amounts decreasing significantly as the needs for services don't decrease significantly. So what can you do? Because these aren't coming through regular waivers, you have to pay attention. You have to know what your state is doing, know what your city is doing, what your town is doing, what the people around you are saying, so you know if this is actually going to go forward. You have to read the local papers and the state papers, because that's where the reporters are actually following the story. If you're in a state where they actually go forward with stakeholder meetings, you have to attend. But not just you. As was seen previously in recent history, how about the people that need the services as well? The parents of the kids who need the services. The kids who need the services. People, not just you providers, but people who are using the services that you provide have to attend those stakeholder meetings if they occur. And if they don't occur, demand that they occur. You have to set alerts in Google. I had to learn how to do it, and I'm an old dog who had to learn new tricks. But put one on block grants and see how many alerts come into your email. It's pretty incredible. So pay attention. If the people in Alaska hadn't paid attention to what the governor was going to do, they would be moving through with block grant legislation. If the people in Utah hadn't gotten very upset, they would have more than a foot in the door for block grants, but they would be where Tennessee is. It is people who make a difference. It is their voice that makes a difference. And wherever you are on any political spectrum, it matters not at all. Because it's a basic truth that, it must be a basic truth, I should say, that kids deserve medical care. Just like they deserve food security. That people who are suffering from serious mental illness deserve the care they need to improve their daily life. People need to be taken care of. And it's our job to make sure they can be taken care of. Talk to your legislators. If you know who they are, and you should know who they are, you can talk to them and tell them what it will impact. Bring those, as I said, if you're not going to get to stakeholder meetings, create your own stakeholder meetings, because that's how this is done. This isn't done because you think about it but don't act. You have to act. And finally, be aware. It is a small comment that's made at a press conference. It is a small comment that's made on your local news. It's a little article that's in the newspaper or in a daily briefing. That's how you know, and that's where it starts. If people don't speak out, then they can't stop it, and they won't. Now, let me be clear. I said a lot earlier, that Rhode Island was an example of a block grant that worked. It worked for a lot of reasons. It got in right under the wire before one president was leaving and another was coming. But mostly it worked because the dollar amount that it got as its baseline was larger than any year it had ever had for Medicaid reimbursement. So they were able to take the excess funds and make significant changes to all the things that slide talked about. But they had the funds to do it. So if your legislature says, oh yes, we want a block grant, but here's what we want. We want 110% of the cost of Medicaid for the last year. We want it to grow at the rate of medical inflation. Then what your state legislature is doing is really quite smart. That's the perfect situation, because then what you get is state control over Medicaid without federal involvement, but enough dollars to ensure that people are covered. And that's the basic underlying truth. It's important that whenever you do, when funding is changed, especially funding that deals with 21% of the people in this country, that it be done to improve and better the circumstances. It ought not to be put forth to decrease the total cost of Medicaid. Medicaid is just getting by in a lot of states. Provider rates are very low, and you know how hard it is to hire and keep staff because your reimbursement rate is hardly equal to the cost of the true cost of that staff. If I'm going to put a plan in place that is going to further impact that possibility, the risk is very real to you and to your clients. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today about block grants. Because it isn't, no matter what I've said, that block grants in and of themselves are in any way bad or evil or dangerous. It is the method by which and the amount to which they are funded and they are and increased over time that cause the greatest concern. If history had shown that block grants had been increased according to inflation, had raised during the recession, hadn't decreased by 27%, then history would show that block grants probably are a good idea. But even Rhode Island, that had that block grant that was so good, has pretty much left most of it and gone back to a more federal match program. Medicaid providers were just learning how to deal with new things like capitation and quality performance. It is my recommendation that as Medicaid providers continue down that path, work for those goals, but don't think that any block grant that may come your way is going to give you a better solution to meet the kinds of things that are being addressed by those programs, because those programs live and are supported by sufficient federal funding. Medicaid is supported by sufficient federal funding. Should block grants come into be, they need to also be supported by sufficient federal funding. If you are so interested to do reading on this subject, the next several slides provide you with some information on various articles, books, magazine articles that you can access to get information about this. These articles are ones that I reviewed for today, follow block grants from 2002 until what's going on today in the current administration. It is important to note that these articles, even today, as I was getting ready for this broadcast, I got information about new articles. That's that Google search or Google info I suggested to you. That's what's important to do, because this information is going to change and kind of change quickly, and this is a way of keeping up with it and keeping on top of what your state is doing. Again, reminder, as I reach the end of, before we go to questions, you don't want to leave after you finish this and after we're done, stay on the page so that you will be able to get the credits that you earn from sitting through today's webinar. And at this point, I'm happy to open it up to question and answer, and I'll try and answer all your questions, anything you put into that box. And if you have any more and you download the slide deck, you'll notice my email address is available on the first slide. Please feel free to reach out and email me if you agree, if you disagree, if you have some other thoughts. I would love to hear them. I would love to talk to you. I would love to correspond with you. So thank you very much. The first question, if a state indeed transitions to block grant funding despite the listed actions, what are the strategies for functioning in this system if stakeholders, especially providers and lower-level government workers, can't prevent the transition? What are the best steps for what happens next? Well, in the states that are transitioning or may transition, the best steps are to be a part of the stakeholder groups. It should be that any state that wants to transition from Medicaid or transition their Medicaid program will have to reach out to the folks who it's going to impact. And that's generally the providers and other clients and consumers. To be a participant in those discussions is your best bet. Now, if you are litigious or you work with ACLU or other, there will probably be lawsuits that go on, and certainly anything you can do towards that end will be helpful if what you're looking to is to revert back to your older system or to the waiver you were under before the block grant. But really, if a state decides to do this, it is talking to your legislators, to your Medicaid director, and to anybody else who has an ability to make the decisions as to how that's going to get implemented in your state. The block grant is just the first step. Everything else follows, and that includes program definition, eligibility definition, etc. Another question, once a state receives a block grant and sees the impact of funding on services is insufficient, can the state then back out receiving block and return to federal funding? This has happened. Whether CMS will allow it is a question that I can't answer. In Rhode Island, where they went to a block grant type funding, they have over time opted out and gone back to a waiver, to their 1115 waiver. It's really unclear as to how a state can make the decision and then opt out of that decision, and it will be under the control, most likely, of CMS as to how they view these grants and whether once you're in, at least it's an annual resubmission or recalculation or recommitment to that block grant. Another question, Today, when states want to change their Medicaid program, they need to submit a state plan amendment and get CMS approval. Is there any discussion of this changing? If states want to come up with innovations, can they do whatever they want, or will they still be required to get CMS approval? The state plan amendment is a good question. Because there's no legislation yet around these block grants, it's unclear. My sense is you would eventually have to amend your state plan amendment because you are going to be changing some of the fundamental plans around your Medicaid population, rates, etc. As far as innovation, the idea of block grants is that once the block grant is provided to the state, CMS steps away and allows the state to do whatever they want, however they want to do it, without any involvement of the feds in deciding what's innovation and what isn't innovation, or what needs to be, or where innovation needs to stop. It's really a question then of how the state wants to do it and what the impact on those stakeholders is by the decisions that the state makes. Another question, do all block grants include reductions in Medicaid spending? Historically, no. Again, the Rhode Island example, there was a rise to the number of dollars that were spent on Medicaid based on their grant agreement with the federal government. However, in general, grants, whether they be Medicaid block grants or any kind of grants of block grant nature, do tend to reduce spending in a small increment at first and then in greater increments over time. It doesn't have to be that way, and states are going to be able to negotiate that, should be able to negotiate the amount of what that block grant or per capita grant will be. But in general, the federal government has looked at block grants as a way to control and or reduce Medicaid spending, not as a way to increase Medicaid spending. The next question sort of follows on, and that is, how do states make up lost funding if there's lost funding in the case of a block grant? That's a good question, because really it's the state's general fund that's going to be called on to make payment in the event the block grant isn't going to cover Medicaid costs. Now, there are Medicaid programs that have gone into effect in a lot of states as a result of waiver that go beyond the basic Medicaid requirements of providing services to a distinct set of a population. The problem will be is, even if a state backs off all those new services, goes back to really just the basic Medicaid population that has always been, has always required Medicaid or been on Medicaid, if they don't have enough money to provide those basic services, states are going to be required to come up with that money. And as I said earlier in the webinar, what happens in the case of a natural disaster, of hurricanes, of the Zika virus, something that is unexpected and does require an increase in funding? That's where the states are fully at risk. There is no participation from the federal government here. States have got to make up that funding through other programs, through other mechanisms that the state has other than just their Medicaid block grant. I have time for a couple more questions. The next question is, how does the federal government determine the block grant amount per state? The question is really an open-ended one. It is possible that states will be able to negotiate with the federal government, in fact would have to negotiate to determine the amount of a block grant or the per capita amount. But the federal government is going to really has the capacity to limit what that amount is, and is in a distinct bargaining position when it comes to that discussion. Well, I have to wrap up now. It is about we're at the end of the time. I want to thank you all for sitting and listening, and certainly I will answer any questions that you submit or think to submit in the future. If you have any, please feel free just to submit the questions, and I'm certain they will get to me and I'll be able to get you answers. And as always, you have my email address should you want to contact me directly. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.